Professor Bulliet is going to be our first speaker. He's at Columbia University, and he has 3 degrees from Harvard. And would you please come up and we'll let you start. As I said, I'm going to be very succinct, laconic with respect to the introduction. This guy's famous. We're lucky to have him. We want to focus on what he has to say and some Q&A opportunities.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak at this event. Is there a breakthrough on the horizon for U.S. and Iran direct talks? I have no idea. And so thank you very much. If you invite a historian, you can't be surprised when you get a history lesson. So I'm going to talk a bit about history. People often ponder the question of whether history moves faster in our times than it has in the past. And most people will say yes, because they'll say, well, planes go faster and instantaneous communication and so forth. And I take the opposite view. I'd say if there is a measure of history that you can have that is a constant measure, it's the human lifespan. Because you may be able to go from, LA to Tehran in just a few hours, actually more than a few. But those hours are every bit as long, and your lifetime is the measure. And this is important because in historical change, what really is important to look at is the cycling through of generations, where people who were socialized or politicized or otherwise drawn into a particular historical nexus come to the end of their careers. And they are succeeded by other people who did not have those same experiences. I'm very interested in the question of comparative revolutions and what happens with a revolution, with the passage of time. And one of the things that I am struck by is that when you get to the time when the revolutionary generation is at retirement age, things will change. And frequently, the people who are at retirement age will do their damnedest to keep them from changing. But they're going to change anyway, because the people who are coming next don't share that background. So now we have an Islamic Republic of Iran. It is basically 35 years old. Between now and when it is 40, we're going to see a very significant turnover of personalities, of people who are considered to be players as opposed to people who are thought of as men of the past generation. Some things we already know are going to be important, such as the demographic bulge that has produced a very, very large youth generation in Iran, which will not be a youth generation in 10 years. It will be a takeover generation. We already know that the majority of the university students in Iran are female, and that Iran has a higher level of female literacy than many countries in the Arab world, because unexpectedly, the policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is notoriously misogynistic in most readings, have created the bases for a great expansion of the talents or the opportunities for women in Iran. It would be naive to think that the youth generation and the shift in gender significance will not play an important role. But the question is, who will negotiate that role? And how will that be manifested in institutional and policy terms? And that, of course, has to do with the turnover of the gatekeepers, the elites, the people who are at the top of the political and institutional apparatus. It is often, I have heard many criticisms of the Islamic Republic of Iran over the last 35 years, as all of you have. I have consistently, since before the revolution began, considered the Iranian religious political experiment to be one of the great experiments of modern times. One of the ones that will have elements of success, elements of failure, but cannot be ignored because it is an experiment that ran from the very beginning counter to what political scientists and sociologists had assumed would be the nature of revolutions. They had assumed that revolutions would be what they called progressive. They had assumed that revolutions would be secular. It turned out it didn't happen that way, or at least not in the way that was anticipated. I would argue that, in fact, elements that are or can be progressive, such as changes in gender roles and so forth, are there in the Islamic Republic. And I also think that it is clear that there is a current of secularization going on in the Islamic Republic. But given the kind of a time warp between the dominant figures and the people who are going to make the changes over the next 5 to 15 years, we don't yet see exactly how this is going to work out. This is normal. This is what happens in revolutions. So let me talk to you a bit about what happened 35 years after the beginning of the American Republic. George Washington becomes president in 1789. So you go 35 years and you have the election of 1824. And the election of 1824 was considered by many people at the time to be a stolen election where devious backroom deals prevented the rightful man from becoming president and put the wrong man in his place because of a rigged vote. Now, we never talk about this because this is the era of the founding fathers. We idolize the founding fathers. We think that they must have been wonderful, wonderful political figures. In fact, they were really marginally competent in many ways. So what happened in 1824? You had basically 5 people who were eligible, that is to say, who had been identified by caucuses within the Congress to be candidates for president. You didn't have parties. All these people ran on the same party. You didn't have primaries. You didn't have conventions. You simply had a caucus within the Congress to decide who should run for president. That caucus, I think they called the Guardian Council. No, maybe, maybe they called it something else. It's just a bad recollection on my part. But the thing is, it wasn't a system where there would be sort of grassroots organizations that would choose the person who should run for president. It was all set up internally. So you had 5 people. You had John Quincy Adams, who thought he deserved it because his father had been president. You had Andrew Jackson, the hero of War of 1812. You had Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and William Crawford. Now, who remembers William Crawford? But normally, the candidates for president at that time were cabinet members, and Crawford was a member of the cabinet. And that's what brought them to the attention of the congressional caucuses, because every cabinet ministry had a corresponding role to play in the Congress, as opposed to the president, who had almost no connection with Congress at all. Presidents did not give speeches to Congress, they did not present legislation. They sat in the White House, and the road from the Capitol to the White House was virtually untrodden. Of course, it was a swamp, but that's beside the point. So you had these guys who had their cliques in Congress who pushed them for the nomination. John C. Calhoun realized that he didn't have a chance. So he withdrew, and he became the vice presidential running mate of two of the other candidates. He was running on two tickets, or two tickets, so to speak. It was only one party. So then you had the vote. The vote was won by Andrew Jackson. He had a plurality, 41%. John Quincy Adams had 39%. And then you had smaller numbers, much smaller numbers, for William Crawford and the other one.
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay, right. So the 12th Amendment of the Constitution had specified that if you have a failure in the Electoral College to get a majority, then they must vote again among the top three finishers. So that meant that three people, Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson, were going to be the finalists, which left Henry Clay out of the running, although he had substantial support. So then what happens is that Henry Clay's people go to support John Quincy Adams, and promptly John Quincy Adams, after being elected, names Henry Clay as Secretary of State. And this was seen by the Jackson people as a deal. It was simply a blatant theft of the election. Jackson should have won. He had carried half the states, whereas John Quincy Adams had carried only a third of the states. And so it was a stolen election. And Andrew Jackson was extremely irate and talked about this great scandal. Well, over time, as we all know, our presidential nomination and electoral system became perfect. And we no longer had stolen elections or irregularly nominated candidates or backroom deals or special log rolling arrangements between potential candidates who would turn over their supporters to someone else. We got rid of all that. But there at the beginning, 35 years after the founding, our system was not a perfect democracy. When we look forward to a presidential election in Iran, it would be foolish to think that you're going to get a perfect democracy in Iran. You know, if the Islamic Republic lasts long enough, say lasts as long as our democracy has, then it will become perfect. We know that that's what history dictates. But things are still in an early stage in terms of the evolution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the anger or anxiety you see so often expressed by Americans and other observers about how the Iranian system is not truly democratic, not perfect, and maybe it's rigged, or even worse, maybe it's not rigged, and so forth. That's normal for a polity at the stage of development that the IRI is at, and it was normal for our republic. In fact, if you make a comparison, the IRI probably works better than the United States of America did, say, between the end of Thomas Jefferson's administration and the end of John Quincy Adams' administration, which was a period of sort of desolate political leadership. in the United States. So I think that people who have a rather short time horizon, looking back or looking forward, often leap to conclusions, rush to judgment, and say things are going to happen in a certain way when they aren't. What's going to happen is something that we cannot predict exactly, but what is going to happen is that over the next few years, we're going to see a turnover of people. And those people are the people who will be involved in direct Iran-US talks if those should gradually be achieved. How would that look from a US perspective? I mean, from an Iranian perspective, obviously some people see a greater desirability to have such talks than others do. But we have a lot of misinterpretation, I think, of the American perspective. Keep in mind, no one under the age of 45 remembers Ayatollah Khomeini. No one in that age category, which includes all of our high school and college students and graduate students, assistant professors, nobody actually remembers the hostage crisis. Nobody remembers the Shah of Iran. It's all history for them. And the one thing I know after 45 years of teaching history is that students don't learn anything. And therefore, if it's history, they probably don't learn it. So what is Iran for these Americans who, over the next 5 to 10 years, will become our takeover generation? Iran is an anti-Israeli state. Iran is a country with nuclear ambitions. Iran is a country whose current president is considered kind of a make-fun-of figure for many Americans. Is Iran seen as a threat to the United States? I don't think it is. I think that the rhetoric surrounding the nuclear and Israel issues has created an illusion that some people buy into and other people do not. And the reason I say this is a year or two ago, a CNN reporter came to my office and to do a little television interview, a real quickie, and said, okay, you know, set up and stand there, and here's cameras on. How much of a danger is Iran to the United States? And I said, 0. Iran's not a danger to the United States. And she sort of nonplussed. No, that's not an answer I can have. I need to know how much. I said, yes, you need to know that the answer is 0. It may be a threat to somebody. That's not a threat to the United States. And you should not be telling people that. So the effort to portray Iran in this way, I think, is there. I think it is not selling terribly well. That's the reason I think that we have a popular mood that would be willing to entertain direct talks. But what could be done to help? One thing is a peculiarity about the Persian language. If you want to say, down with something, you say, marg bar something. Marg bar America, death to America. Marg bar Israel, death to Israel. Marg bar bad hijabi, death to the woman who's letting her hair show because she wears a bad hijab. And so you say, well, why don't they say down with instead of death to? Well, today I was asking a really brilliant specialist, an Iranian specialist on Iranian language, literature, history, and said, how do you say down with in Persian? What's the alternative to death to? he said, you can't. It's kind of death to or nothing. It's what you say. And then my friend who was at the table, and who's a specialist in Turkey, was saying, God, I don't think we can say down with in Turkish. And it was pointed out that during the revolution, when people were saying, Married by America, death to America, you had posters in English that were saying, down with America, because that's what it means. And yet, one of the peculiar things that Americans associate with Iran is big crowds of people saying, death to America. And I think, well, supposing you had big crowds of Americans saying, death to Iran, that would be a sea change in world politics. Because we have the alternative, we can say down with. And I think one of the things I'd like to see is candidates for president in the upcoming election in Iran to say that they will declare a moratorium on anyone in an official position saying, Married by America. It's time to get rid of the idea that death to is an acceptable locution in international affairs, particularly between countries that have as much in common and as many important things to talk about as Iran and the United States. And what I think is the case is that the Iranian officialdom doesn't realize, because they think they're saying down with. And it's translated by CNN and others, Fox News, as death to. So, you know, it's an atmospheric thing, but I think that atmospherics count at this particular juncture, where there is a possibility of movement, but you need to have something that becomes visible and means something, even if it's meaningless. And I think that if you had a moratorium declared on that silly locution, as minor as it is, I think that would have an impact, and I think it would get reported. And I think that people would feel, oh, things are improving with Iran. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.